Peter MacKay is a former Minister of Defense and Justice and Foreign Affairs in the former Harper government. He's also a former Crown Prosecutor, and he joins me today from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Peter MacKay, first of all, good to speak with you again, and thanks for taking time to be with us. I've reached out to you today in your capacity as a former Harper Cabinet Minister, and now we see lots of reports and suggestions, indications that Mark Norman's defense team reached out to the Conservatives to make the case against the breach of trust charge, and what they found and heard, at least in part, seems to have led prosecutors to stay that charge. We know your former cabinet colleague, now Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, spoke with the defense team. Did you speak with the Norman defense team?
Well, Peter, it's good to speak to you. And the short answer is yes. I had a fairly lengthy, involved conversation with Marie Henein and Ms. Mainville at our Toronto law office some time ago, in anticipation that I may have been called as a Crown witness, as was reported. But I was never contacted by the prosecutor's office. There was never any outreach. And Marie Henein, in particular, being the very thorough defense counsel that she is, reached out to me, and we had a lengthy discussion about Mark and the case that was against him, and the circumstances leading up to the laying of the charge, which do go back to our time in government, because it was under the Harper government that the contract to the Davie shipyard for the Navy replenishment ship was let. And that contract, fast forwarding to today, has led to one of the most successful procurements by the Canadian Armed Forces in decades. And that ship is at sea, and it's doing what it was intended to do: refuel ships in the Canadian Navy, and provide that very important, critical enabler for the Canadian Armed Forces.
You know, I'm no lawyer, you are, but it strikes me in listening to what you're telling me that you were first, there was a possibility you would be a Crown witness, but the Crown never approached you, but the defense did. And that makes me wonder if there was something that Mark Norman was able to tell them about his role that made the defense say, you know what, we're going to go talk to Peter MacKay to find out exactly what happened here. What were you able to tell them about Mark Norman?
Well, I was able to tell them that he was a highly professional, excellent leader within the Canadian Forces, almost 4 decades of service in uniform to Canada, that all of my dealings with him were of the highest caliber. He was passionate, he was informed, intelligent. He was always looking out for the best interests of his sailors, of men and women in uniform across the Canadian Armed Forces. And he was entirely motivated to improve Canada's place in the world. That was his life's work as a sailor, as somebody who rose to second in command in the Canadian Forces. And I have nothing but the highest respect and admiration for Mark Norman. And I think it's appalling what he went through, and the pall that was cast over his reputation, what his family had to endure. It is a disgraceful chapter in Canadian legal and military history that Mark Norman was persecuted in this way.
Were you, so you weren't approached by the Crown, correct? Just to confirm
I was
that.
not.
Okay.
In the media, Peter, I first learned that I might be a witness by a report that I saw in the media. I was never approached by Crown prosecutors.
Were you ever called by the RCMP?
I was.
Okay, can you tell me about that?
Well, only that it was for a very narrow purpose, to confirm an email exchange that I had with Mark Norman. And again, this was not unusual, because not only was I in various portfolios, but I was chair of the National Security Committee. So we were dealing with a lot of issues, and it was not uncommon for Mark and I to communicate. I wouldn't call it offline, because it would be no different than having a conversation out of the cabinet room.
Okay. It's now become clear that Vice-Admiral Norman, it would seem, was working closely with the Harper PMO, the Minister of Defense at the time, Jason Kenney, to get this deal done. There seemed to be, this is what, if I can put it this way, and I'm not sure how aware you were of these discussions, it was clear that this is what Cabinet wanted. They wanted a fast-track supply ship. They wanted this contract to move along, and Mark Norman was the guy driving it. Is that your sense of what was happening at the time?
Yes, Peter, but to put it in context, we have to remind ourselves that we had lost the 2 supply ships, the Preserver and the Protector, as a result of a fire, and simply the fact that they had expired. They were well beyond their best before date. And so there was critical urgency. We would literally not have been able to participate in international missions or go very far out of the ports in Canada were it not for the replacement of those supply ships. And so two other important factors, the national shipbuilding procurement strategy had been executed. The shipyards on the east and west coasts were working at full capacity, and the most expedient way to get this supply ship to replace those enablers was the proposal that came forward from Davy. Now, the others also were interested and perhaps didn't like the expedited process, the sole source process, but I would say then and now this was the best way forward, and it has proved out to be extremely advantageous for the Navy and for the Canadian Forces. We were proven to be right.
Okay, help me out here as a former Crown attorney. How would, and this is what I think a lot of us want, this is one of the key questions for us, and we don't know now, what exactly was the new evidence that the prosecutors saw that made them go, you know what, we don't have a case against this guy anymore? How would seeing new information that maybe showed how closely the former commander of the Navy was working with Cabinet, what his interests were, the suggestion that there were no self-interests, he was trying to do what was right, as he says, for the Navy, for the country, for the armed forces. How would that weaken the prosecution case of breach of trust?
Well, because I think you've hit on it, Peter, it's motive. And what was to benefit Mark Norman by putting information out there about a contract that had been essentially let to Davy Shipyard. There was nothing in it for Mark Norman. He was entirely motivated by the best interests of the Canadian Forces and the Navy in particular, and had no real ability to shape the outcome. There's an interesting element to this that goes to the very origins, Peter, and that is James Cudmore's role in this. And James Cudmore, you will recall, was a CBC reporter who first leaked this story at a date and time. Shortly thereafter, he went to work for the Minister of Defense. Curious. Then, when the story took on further legs and the investigation, if you will, that led to the charges, James Cudmore has remained mysteriously quiet about all of this. So it goes back to not the motive of Mark Norman, but the motive of the government and what they were trying to do. It seems to me, and this is a political rather than a legal analysis, that this was very much about intimidating the public service. It was about a very venal attempt to punish somebody who they felt had leaked a story that was embarrassing for them. And it was meant, I think, in the broader sense, to put a chill over the entire public service, to say, if we can go after the second in command of the Canadian Forces, we can go after you. And that should be chilling for Canadians, because that means they can go after anyone. Mark Norman, first and foremost, is a Canadian citizen. And the government brought their entire prosecutorial and legal weight down upon him in an attempt in what they thought would silence him and intimidate him and punish him and destroy his reputation. Well, Mark proved to be made of pretty good wood, and he stood up to them, as have others that we've seen in recent days in this government on similar type of repressive and interference from the government, repressive activity. And this bodes very poorly for our system of justice and procurement, our Canadian Armed Forces, and our reputation both at home and abroad. It is an appalling lack of exercise of discretion when it comes to the government. And there has to be an accounting. There has to be somebody take responsibility for this and explain what happened and why was Mark Norman literally hung out to dry. This is the 21st century equivalent of a keel haul, what the Navy used to call for the punishment. Right. And Mark Norman didn't deserve it then. He certainly deserves, in my view, to be reinstated and to be handsomely compensated for what he and his family have been through.
All right, Peter MacKay, thanks for your time on this today. Good to speak with you. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Peter.